guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be reacting to a video called Why the Netherlands is Europe's most OP country. No idea what that could mean. OP, I don't really know. I'm trying to think of something. I'm coming up short. I have no idea. Like OP as in like what could it mean? Like something about like how rich they are. I like the GDP. I don't know. I have no idea. But hopefully we're gonna find out. So let's check it out and comment, like, and subscribe.
The Netherlands is a small country in the northwest corner of Europe that most people these days associate with urban planning YouTubers and amazing bicycling infrastructure.
Yes.
But at first glance, this country may still appear rather unassuming. It's only a little larger than the US state of Maryland is, but with a population of nearly 18 million people all contained within it. The Netherlands is among the most densely populated countries anywhere in the world today. The country's density of people is about on a par with India, and when excluding small city-states, the country is the densest population of people in Europe, behind only Malta, which itself is only a tiny island state. Nonetheless, 18 million people is still a rather small population at a global scale, and it's only enough to make the Netherlands the 69th largest country in terms of people. While, of course, in terms of land, the country is even smaller and ranks down at only 131st place worldwide. But despite not having a lot of land and not having a lot of people, the Netherlands punches far, far above its weight in global importance. And I'm going to argue here that the Netherlands is by far the most overpowered country relative to its size in Europe today.
That's what it means, overpowered.
Take the country's exports, for example. Somehow, despite being among the world's smaller countries in terms of land and people, the Netherlands is among the absolute biggest countries in the world in terms of how much stuff they export out to the global market. In terms of value of goods and services, the Netherlands is currently the 5th largest exporter in the entire world, pumping out way more goods and services toward the global market than dozens of other countries many times its size are capable of, like India, the UK, or Italy. And when you dig deeper into what kinds of goods and services the Dutch are exporting, it still gets even more interesting. It probably shouldn't be a surprise to most people that the United States of America is the most dominant agricultural superpower in the world. The country has the second highest amount of total arable land in the world behind only India, while the United States even further completely controls the largest continuous stretch of farmland located anywhere in the world too. The Mississippi River Basin. With a population only a fraction of India's, the United States is capable of producing far more food than it actually needs for itself. And so it's no surprise then that the United States is the largest exporter of agricultural products in the world. But if you had to guess which country is the second largest exporter of agricultural goods in the world, your mind might wander around other huge countries with extensive farmland like Russia, Ukraine, France, China, or even Brazil. Very few people would immediately know that despite only having 5% of the population as the United States, and despite the United States possessing a whopping 234 times more land, the little Netherlands is actually the second largest exporter of agricultural products in the world, and is somehow able to pump out more than 2/3 of all the agricultural goods to the world market than America does.
They don't have land or people.
Again, beating out countries that are way bigger than it, like Brazil, Germany, and China in the process. In terms of global trade, the little Netherlands is truly one of the world's great powers. And that brings with it some majorly outsized economic power. Despite only being the 131st largest country in terms of land and only the 69th largest country in terms of people, the Netherlands is the 17th largest country in terms of economic size, controlling an annual GDP that is larger than Turkey's, despite having only 1/5 of the population. Perhaps even more impressively, the Dutch economy is presently more than half the size of Russia's, the biggest country in the world that sprawls across Eurasia and that has more than 8 times as many people as the Netherlands does. So how did the Netherlands manage to pull off this massively outsized influence on the world stage? What is it about this country that makes it the most overpowered in Europe? And why is its influence so frequently overlooked today when it really shouldn't be? To begin with, it's important to clarify how the geography of the Netherlands directly lends to the country's ability to project trade power, and always has. The country occupies this perfectly positioned spot that's almost dead in the center of Europe, roughly equidistant from Spain and Portugal in the west and from Russia in the east. This
Oh,
position has always made the Netherlands a natural stopover point for trade between Russia and Scandinavia in the east, and Spain and Portugal in the west. An advantage that is only massively amplified by the fact that many of Europe's mightiest rivers empty out directly at this location as well.
Oh,
the
really?
Rhine, Meuse, Scheldt, and Ems rivers all empty out in the
All of
North
them?
Sea through the
Well, a lot of
Netherlands and are all highly navigable for most of their lengths, granting easy commercial access to the Dutch coast deep into the hinterlands of Germany, Switzerland, and France that can be traversed by cheap and easy-to-use river barges. This has made the Netherlands ideally positioned for commerce and trade for centuries. But it's also a double-edged sword, because the rivers
Why?
emptying out here essentially means that the
have a
entire
lot of
country
water.
is basically a giant river delta that's almost surrounded by water. And the Dutch relationship with water virtually defines this entire country. The water simultaneously presents a major threat and a major opportunity to the Netherlands. On the one hand, the very name of the Netherlands, translating roughly into English as the lowlands, gives a hint towards how
Yes.
much of a danger the water can
It's literally
pose.
lowlands.
Roughly 26% of the country's landmass today is beneath sea level,
That's
and about
crazy.
half of the country is beneath 1 meter in elevation. The country is notoriously flat and low-lying. And the
Yeah.
highest point in the entire country is located in the extreme south, far away from the ocean, and only stands at 322 meters high.
That's crazy
Which is
to me,
basically
insane.
just a big hill. This is
Insane.
why, when it comes to average elevation, the Netherlands is the 7th lowest country in the entire world and by far the lowest country in Europe. And even that's not really very fair, because most of the countries that are lower than the Netherlands are tiny Pacific Island states, and none of them are
islands.
anywhere near to being as geographically large. So you have all of this super low-lying land directly adjacent to the North Sea, and all of these huge rivers that empty out into the country that basically make the Netherlands the gutter of Europe.
Oh,
Which all
but-
combine to make the Netherlands
offensive.
among the most catastrophically flood-prone countries in the world. Even today, more than 1 in 5 people in the Netherlands lives in an area that's beneath sea level, or about
That's
3.7 million
scary.
people. To many countries around the world, their biggest national security threat is their immediate neighbors. Ukraine and Finland prepare for attacks from Russia. Israel prepares for attacks coming from all around them. India prepares for attacks from Pakistan, and South Korea from North Korea, and so on. In a sense, the Netherlands is no different today. But rather than any of their borders
It's
on
the
land,
water.
it is their border with the sea that is the biggest threat. And rather than any attacks from human beings, it is attacks from the
nature.
ocean itself that poses the greatest national security threat to the Dutch people. For centuries, the people who have lived here have fought tirelessly to push the ocean back and keep the water out from their lands. The evidence of which is littered all across the country today in the form of windmills that pumped water out of sodden farmland, canals that took the water out to the sea, and dikes that prevented more
I have to say that speaks very highly of the Dutch people, because I think, you know, other type of people, other civilizations, other cultures would have probably just given up. Not in modern in like the modern era, but like back in those days, I think people would have just given up and said, you know what, whatever, let's just, the water should take this land. We'll leave actually.
water from gushing in. More than 700 years ago, back in the 14th century, the Netherlands looked a lot more like this, with significant amounts of the country we know today being buried beneath the sea.
It's insane.
Even the location of modern-day Schiphol
I think
Airport,
that
the
does-
busiest airport in the Netherlands and the 3rd busiest airport in Europe, was underwater back then. But over the many
Underwater?
centuries since that time, generation after generation of people in the Netherlands have spent their lives steadily pushing the water back with the aforementioned windmills, canals,
It's
and
insane.
dikes, to the point where by the start of the 20th century, the Dutch had reclaimed roughly 1,285,000 acres worth of land from the sea and by draining lakes. But the Dutch didn't always want to push the water out of their country all the time. Sometimes they wanted to let it in as well. Since the
Wasn't it
Netherlands
enough?
is a
They had
small
enough
but
water.
densely populated country that's about as flat as a pancake, the Dutch have never really had
Flat as
many
a
natural
pancake.
geographic features to protect themselves against outside invaders coming from France or Germany. But in the 17th century, they realized that deliberately flooding their own low-lying lands in a controlled manner could serve the same defensive role that mountains do for other countries.
Makes
and so,
sense.
their geographic weakness of being susceptible to flooding could be cleverly transformed into geographic strength,
Yeah.
too. Over
It's
a
true.
period of 200 years from the 17th to 19th centuries,
That's
the
a
Dutch
lot.
tirelessly constructed the water line. a series of water-based defenses that could be deliberately flooded in the event of an invasion to protect Amsterdam by nearly transforming the Holland region into an island. Later on, between 1880 and 1920, the Dutch constructed an even more extensive system of water-based defenses completely encircling Amsterdam that they called the Amsterdam Defense Line. The line formed a huge ring around the city of Amsterdam that could be deliberately flooded to a shallow depth of about 30 centimeters or 12 inches. Deep enough to be a geographic hindrance to infantry and cavalry, but shallow enough to prevent an enemy from using boats across it. Unfortunately for the Dutch, however, the creation of the Amsterdam Defense Line roughly coincided with the invention of the airplane and the tank. And so by the time that Germany invaded the Netherlands in 1940, the Amsterdam Defense Line was already obsolete.
Yeah, that's so
Nonetheless, over the centuries from 1300 to 1900, where the Dutch reclaimed nearly 1.3 million acres of land from the sea and lakes in the country, they also lost another 1.4 million acres of land area to the Zuiderzee, a shallow bay of the North Sea that was only about 4 to 5 meters deep that existed in the northwest of the country just to the east of Amsterdam. There had long been discussions within the Netherlands to drain the Zuiderzee and reclaim huge amounts of the land within it for human settlement for centuries. But the technological ability for them to actually do that was lacking up until around the late 19th century. It was then in 1891 that a man named Cornelis Lely actually drafted up a feasible plan to drain out the Zuiderzee, a plan that would become the basis for the later Zuiderzee works that would completely and radically transform the geography of the Netherlands forever. In 1916, a violent storm sent a surge of water from the North Sea into the Zuiderzee that overwhelmed several dikes around it and caused wide-scale flooding, which provided the impetus for the Dutch government to officially begin carrying out Cornelis Lely's grand vision for taming the Zuiderzee he had come up with 25 years previously. The first step of the plan called for the construction of a huge dam across the northern section of the Zuiderzee here, running between the Dutch provinces of North Holland and Friesland. The dam would be 32 kilometers or 20 miles long and would come to be called the Afsluitdijk, or the Closure Dike in English. As its name suggests, the Afsluitdijk was built to isolate the saltwater Zuiderzee from any access to the salty ocean in the North Sea. And it took the Dutch years of effort to construct it between 1927 and 1932. After it was completed, the dam was designed to include a series of sluice gates that enabled the Dutch to begin draining salt water out of the Zuiderzee, while fresh water would continue flowing into the sea from the River IJssel. Over time, this meant that the Zuiderzee was transformed from a salty outlet of the North Sea into a brand new freshwater lake that the Dutch renamed the IJsselmeer, or the IJssel Lake. And even further, the Afsluitdijk also serves as a causeway, enabling Dutch travelers to drive their vehicles directly from North Holland to Friesland without having to travel all the way around the Zuiderzee like they used to. Now, the original plan of the Zuiderzee works was that after the sea was enclosed by the Afsluitdijk and tamed, huge tracts of new land would be built within the new IJsselmeer called polders, which are essentially chunks of an area within the lake that the Dutch would dam off from the rest of the lake with dikes, after which the water enclosed by the dikes would all get pumped out to reveal fresh, dry virgin land suitable for colonization. The first of these polders within the IJsselmeer that the Dutch constructed was this one here called the Varingermeer, that was fully drained to water by 1930. An early proving concept and testbed that would influence the ideas and techniques used in all of the subsequent polder construction going forward.
They're like, it works.
Varingermeer opened up about 307 square kilometers of extra land to the Netherlands that was incorporated within the North Holland province, and more than 12,000 people live there today. A few years later, work on the second polder, named the Noordoostpolder, began in 1936 and was eventually fully drained out and ready for settlement by 1942. And then, after the conclusion of the Second World War, work finally began on the single largest land reclamation projects of the entire Zuiderzee works in the south of the IJsselmeer. Originally intended to be a single massive polder, work on dredging up Flevoland finally began in 1950. But several changes were made to the original plan as they went about it. The development of the previous Noordoostpolder had left the new, lower-lying land in the polder directly connected to the older and higher elevated mainland, which led to groundwater from the higher mainland seeping into the new lower land, which led to the ground in the mainland to start sinking and causing all kinds of problems. The original plan for the Flevoland polder was to leave it connected to the mainland as well. But after observing the problems with the Noordoostpolder, the Dutch decided to change the design of Flevoland into two separate halves, an eastern Flevoland polder and a southern Flevoland polder, with a narrow southern channel of water separating both of them from the mainland. Unlike the two polders that came before it, Flevoland was both geographically large enough and close enough to the major city of Amsterdam that Dutch
so
planners
close.
knew it had the potential to host major cities on it after it was
Yeah.
finished being dredged up.
I didn't know
As
it
a
was so close
result,
to
after
Amsterdam.
Eastern Flevoland was finished being created in 1957, and after Southern Flevoland was finished up a decade later in 1968, they became the site of the biggest planned cities on the new polders, like Almere, strategically and conveniently located only about 20 kilometers away from the bustling
What?
city center of
That's so,
Amsterdam, the Netherlands'
that's
biggest
right
city.
next by.
Almere is therefore the most recently settled city in the Netherlands that was only established in 1975. And it's
Wow,
also,
that's so
probably to
recent.
my knowledge, the largest city in all of Europe that was only settled in the 20th century.
Yeah, that's
The very
crazy.
first house in Almere was only finished in 1976. And fast
That's like
forward roughly
40
half a
years ago?
century later to
50?
today, and Almere has ballooned to a population of about 215,000 residents, making it the
lot.
largest city to be established on any of the new Dutch polders and the 8th largest city in the Netherlands
Oh, wow.
nationwide. And by 2030, Almere plans to construct enough housing to boost their city population up to 350,000 residents.
Wow,
which by
almost
that
half a
point
million.
could make Almere the 5th largest city in the country.
Yeah.
By
that's a lot.
1986, the Netherlands
For
did
Amsterdam.
something that no other country in Europe had done in the
Netherlands.
20th century. They declared a brand new province out of their freshly created land they had conquered from the sea. Dubbed the Flevoland province, it encompasses all of the newly created land in the Noordoostpolder and the southern and eastern Flevoland
What does Flevoland
polders,
mean?
representing a total amount of land that's larger than Hong Kong that was conquered
Oh.
not through brute military force at the expense of others, but
Just
through
technology.
decades of brilliant and forward-looking
Yeah.
engineering for the benefit of the state. The creation of the Flevoland province from nothing has dramatically assisted the housing crisis in the densely populated Netherlands too. As of 2023, about 445,000 people live within Flevoland on land that didn't even exist only a few decades ago.
That's insane
as is
to me.
symbolized by the province's official anthem called Where We Make Cities Arise. Today,
Oh,
roughly
I
20%
like that.
of all the land in the Netherlands has been reclaimed from the sea at some point or another over the past 700 years, representing an area of land that is larger than nearby Luxembourg that has been conquered by Dutch engineers
Oh, but
rather than by
Luxembourg's tiny.
Dutch soldiers. And the country still isn't finished yet with reclaiming even more land from the sea either.
Oh my God,
You see,
okay.
the original plan for the Zuiderzee works called for another 5th polder to be constructed here in the southwest of the IJsselmeer. It was going
How
to be
much could
called
they
the
want?
Markerwaard polder, with a narrow canal between it and the southern Flevoland polder leading directly to Amsterdam so that Amsterdam would maintain its maritime access to the rest of the lake. The
Yeah.
Markerwaard polder, had it ever been built, was planned to add another 410 square kilometers of colonizable land to the country's territory, about equivalent to the Hawaiian island of Lanai in scale. Between 1963 and 1975, the Dutch slowly constructed what many believed was the prerequisite step for this 5th polder, a large 28-kilometer-long dike or dam across the IJsselmeer that split the lake into two that became known as the Hoetribdijk. After its completion, the Hoetribdijk divided the IJsselmeer into two separate distinct lakes, which led to the lake to the west of the Hoetribdijk becoming known as the Markermeer Lake, and the rest of the IJsselmeer staying named as the IJsselmeer. The Hoetribdijk also provided a direct overland connection for vehicles to take between Flevoland and the northern part of North Holland. And after its completion, the Markerwaard polder was originally intended to be developed out of the Markermeer Lake. But then, for decades, none of that ever ended up happening. On the one
Why?
hand, those in favor of pushing on with the Markerwaard polder argued that it would open up new agricultural land, create new housing, and open up the
Yeah.
possibility of building a brand new airport close by to Amsterdam to relieve
Another
congestion
airport?
at Schiphol Airport. But on the other hand, those in favor of keeping the Markermeer as a lake argued that in the case of a drought, the lake's water would be useful for a drinking water supply, and that during
That's
heavy weather events,
true.
the lake would serve as a valuable buffer zone protecting Amsterdam and Almere from
yeah.
the wrath of the sea. Concerns over the Markerwaard's financial viability began to emerge in the 1980s as the debate continued on, and
Oh,
the
they didn't
project
have
was
money.
eventually indefinitely suspended in 1986, and then completely canceled altogether later on in 2003.
Oh.
But the discussions on dredging up land within the Markermeer never fully went away.
I like the fact that I think maybe you can see them as failures. I don't know if failure is the right term. They're just like switching things up as they go, which I think is very interesting because when you hear about the Netherlands, you're like, oh, you know, there is like a wonder of engineering. They've done great things, and obviously they have. But I think a great sort of like advice or takeaway that you can get from this is that they've switched around. Like they maybe they had like a set of plans, but as you know, time went on, maybe some people realize, you know what, maybe like the initial plan was not the best, and we should probably like make adjustments, which I think it's really good because it shows that, hey, you know, we don't really have all the answers, and we're just like figuring things out as we go. And like, that's not a bad thing, and changing plans and making adjustments, it's never a bad thing. So I really do like that sort of like train of thought, because you can see that that's the way you can be successful.
And they got officially revived somewhat in 2012, when a new project was proposed to build out a series of smaller artificial islands behind the Hootrup Dike within the area that was originally proposed for the much larger Markerward polder. Unlike the originally proposed Markerward, these smaller islands aren't intended to be inhabited by humans, but are meant to serve as a wildlife refuge and tourism destination instead. The first of the islands was dredged up as virgin land in 2016, and several more islands have been built out since then as the newest land in the Netherlands and in Europe. But the conquest of these new lands from the sea is not the only thing that the Dutch have accomplished in their centuries-long war with the sea, because they've also fought tirelessly to keep the sea out from everything that they've spent generations building. Flooding has been a constant concern in this country since time immemorial, and in 1953, the country suffered an extremely devastating one. A powerful storm gathered in the North Sea and sent a huge surge of water smashing against the southward coast of the Netherlands, in between the Zeeland province and Rotterdam. The levees and dikes in the area were overwhelmed and breached in dozens of locations, sending the storm surge through and flooding nearly 1,400 square kilometers of land in the country. The resulting destruction was utterly catastrophic. More than 1,800 people in the Netherlands were killed by the water's fury, while 9% of the country's farmland was inundated with seawater, and 10,000 buildings were destroyed. The disaster produced so much grief and shock in the nation that the entire country collectively vowed that such a thing should never be possible in the future again. And so began the impetus for another decades-long macro-engineering project in the country that became known as the Delta Works. While the Zuiderzee Works were primarily offensive in nature, conquering new land from the sea, the Delta Works were designed to be more defensive in nature and would ultimately prove to be effectively the Dutch version of China's Great Wall. In 1958, the Dutch government pledged to spend a whopping 20% of its total national GDP on the project that would be spread out over the next 25 years. For about the next 3 decades after that, the Dutch society built out a massive series of dams, dikes, levees, sluices, locks, and storm surge barriers all across the provinces of Zeeland and South Holland that were most severely affected by the 1953 flood. The aim of which was to effectively reduce the length of the Dutch coastline and reduce the number of dikes that had to be raised in order to better defend this part of the country from the wrath of the North Sea. There are many incredibly impressive feats of engineering that the Dutch pulled off during the Delta Works project, but a few of the most impressive include the Oosterscheldekering, translated into English as the Eastern Scheldt Storm Surge Barrier, that was constructed over the course of a decade between 1976 and 1986. This single giga project is the largest single storm surge barrier ever constructed by humanity, and it basically serves as a gigantic gate that protects the inner part of the Netherlands' Zeeland province from the North Sea. Its sluice gates normally remain open to allow water to freely travel between both sides. But in the event of a dangerous storm surge emerging in the North Sea, the sluice gates can be slammed shut, and the Oosterscheldekering transforms into a protective shield to keep the water out.
So it's perfect.
One of the other greatest marvels of engineering that the Dutch created in the overall Delta Works project was right here at the artificial mouth of the Rhine River, only about a 30-minute drive west of downtown Rotterdam, the second largest city in the Netherlands and home to the country's biggest port. Rotterdam is a city that is particularly vulnerable to flooding naturally, because about 90% of the city's area lies beneath sea level, and it's located directly adjacent to the Rhine and very close by to the North Sea.
Scary.
Thus, between 1991 and 1997, the Dutch constructed a massive storm surge barrier right at the mouth of the river that they called the Maaslandkering. The structure consists of 2 gargantuan arms, each roughly the size of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and each about twice as heavy, making the structure the largest moving object that humanity has ever created. When water levels in the North Sea are detected to be high enough to cause a storm surge through the river towards Rotterdam, the Maaslandkering gates can be given the order to close in a process that takes 2.5 hours to complete. After which, the enormous water pressure in the North Sea gets transferred from the wall of the gates to the 2 largest ball joints in the entire world implanted on the river's banks, each one having a diameter of 10 meters and a weight of 680 tons.
Have they used this?
An advanced computer system can automatically close and open the gates based on the water levels on either side. And it, along with the rest of the other massive projects in the overall DeltaWorks program, were designed to protect the Netherlands from even a once-in-10,000-year intensity storm. It's a small wonder then that the DeltaWorks defensive program and the Zuiderzee Works offensive program together were named as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world by the American Society of Civil Engineers in 1994. And all of this extensive experience at fighting against the ocean like nobody else has over decades and centuries have made the Dutch the foremost global experts in protecting themselves from rising sea levels in the global ocean. A problem that will only continue getting worse for billions of people all around the world in the 21st century as global climate change continues to increase the ocean's sea level. This has ended up perfectly positioning the Dutch to be the global leaders at climate change adaptation for coastal cities and communities everywhere in the world. Dutch consultants already travel all around the world to other coastal communities threatened by sea level rise like New York, Miami, New Orleans, Jakarta, and the entirety of Bangladesh, offering up their expertise and knowledge and bringing back more money and wealth to the Dutch economy in the process. The entire nationwide system in the Netherlands of dikes, dams, pumps, and sluices is so impressive that without any of them, a 2007 era study from Calvin University in the United States found that 65% of the Netherlands would be completely underwater during high tide. As the famous saying about the Netherlands goes, God may have created the earth, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. No other country in the world has been as meticulously over-engineered and created by its people over generations than the Netherlands has been. And that long history of cooperation and collective effort against the sea has produced a unique culture in the country that prioritizes trust, collaboration, collective good, and efficiency over everything else. Attributes that spill out into the rest of the country in sometimes surprising ways. From the intelligent designs of Dutch cities and infrastructure to prioritize human beings over cars, to the shepherding of Schiphol Airport's strategic location in the center of Europe to become the 3rd busiest airport on the continent behind only Charles de Gaulle near Paris and London Heathrow.
That's insane to me.
But another major geographic advantage to power, especially to trade power, that the Netherlands has always had is their incredibly lucky possession of the Port of Rotterdam. Today, the Port of Rotterdam sprawls out across a huge area that's larger than the island of Manhattan in New York. With 4 fully automated terminals that accept vessels around the clock at all times of the day, every day of the year. The water depth within the port is deep enough to handle.
I thought that because in modern, but of course kind of like stupid of me to think of like, oh, they don't really use that much, the port these days because, you have airplanes, but it's like, no, of course a lot of things are still being transported like via ship. So of course, like it makes sense that yes, their location is perfect and yes, it's still being used like by a lot of boats every single day.
Handle even the largest of container ships that have ever been built.
Exactly.
Its central location is almost dead in the center between Western and Eastern Europe, and the connections that stretch out from the port to the European market are just completely unmatched anywhere else. From Rotterdam, navigable rivers like the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt extend deep into the hinterlands of Germany, Belgium, France, and Switzerland. And since 1992, when the Rhine-Main-Danube Canal was completed and opened, the navigable parts of the Main and the Danube rivers are also accessible, which has opened up the hinterlands of Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Ukraine, all to inland shipping connected to Rotterdam as well. Cheap to operate river barges from all of these countries can easily travel through this network of rivers directly to Rotterdam and transfer their cargoes onto massive ocean-going container ships for export anywhere in the world, while they can also receive imports through the same system from anywhere else as well. But it's the Netherlands.
Again, that to me it's crazy. I think it's because, again, I'm thinking, well, but you have airplanes. But obviously, like, I'm thinking of, like, smaller things. I actually do not know. Obviously, if you're, I don't know, transporting, like, a million other things, obviously, you're not transporting them throughout, like, airplanes. But it's crazy to me that we're still, as humans, are still using ships because I think it's something to me that is sort of, like, old-timey. I don't know. It's kind of surprising to me that we haven't invented something else that can like work. Like, I know maybe it's a situation like if it ain't broke, like why would you fix it? It's because it's boats, they have like large containers, like they can move fast, as we can see there's like a whole interconnected system. But again, like as humans beings, I don't know. I think it's weird that we haven't like figured out a way of like move like huge like loads of stuff like in something that's not a ship. But I'm trying to think of like what else would you do, and I'm like I have no idea. Underground tunnels, it would be probably more expensive. But again, it's maybe it's like a little silly of me to think, but it's like ships are like still be we're still transporting like goods and stuff and products like with ships, which as we have done for the past, I don't know, 600 years. It's kind of crazy.
Itself that has by far the densest network of inland waterways in Europe.
There's like so many
the country
rivers.
is home to 2,200 kilometers worth of navigable internal waterways that are used for commercial shipping and that account for 40% of all the international freight movement within the country.
Wow.
And 20% of the country's domestic freight travel. With roughly 6,000 ships sailing through its various rivers and channels, the Dutch inland waterways account for a staggering nearly 80% of all the vessels that sail inland within the entire European continent, enabling the Dutch to move around cargo much more efficiently and cheaply than any other country in Europe is even remotely capable of.
Why is it cheaper?
And it's not just water-based transportation that's so easy from Rotterdam either. The port acts as a hub of several different transportation systems that radiate out from it, including railways and highways. The Betuwe-Route, for example, is a double-track freight railway line that runs directly from Rotterdam to Germany, where it links up with Germany's Oberhausen-Arnhem Railway, which extends all the way down to the northern reaches of the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. The Ruhr metropolitan area is the largest urban conglomeration in Germany and the second largest in the entire European Union, with a population of around 11.3 million people and an annual GDP on its own of $580 billion in 2021.
That's a lot.
Which would make the Ruhr Valley on its
people.
own the world's 25th largest economy if it was independent. And all of the goods it produces can be easily transported by railway, river barge, or truck directly to Rotterdam for export out to the global market. Railroads emanating from Rotterdam can move goods as far away as Brest, Marseille, Berlin, and Augsburg in under 8 hours.
Oh, wow,
Most of the continent
so
can be
quick.
reached by rail in under 24 hours. The port operates thousands of direct connections around the world by sea,
like
rail, and truck, and it's
This is
essentially
crazy.
the most convenient and easy to access port for around 500 million consumers throughout the European continent.
Wow.
It's no wonder then that for a very long time, the port of Rotterdam was the busiest and largest port in the entire world, all the way up until the year 2004, when it was finally overtaken in annual cargo
who?
tonnage by the port of Singapore. Since then,
it's
Rotterdam's
Singapore.
business has been overtaken by several additional ports in China. But Rotterdam continues
Makes
to remain
sense.
by
Of course,
far
it's
the
China.
busiest port in Europe and the busiest port in the world, located anywhere outside of East Asia. Its importance to
Yeah,
Europe
makes
from a
sense.
commercial perspective is so enormous that it
It's like Asia's a
still
little
handles
bigger.
more cargo tonnage than the next two busiest ports on the continent combined. Nearby Antwerp and faraway Novorossiysk. The port of
I didn't
Antwerp
know
in
there were
Belgium
those.
benefits from much of the same geographic and infrastructure advantages as Rotterdam does.
I was gonna say,
And
you
taken
can say, like,
together, they handle about as much
they're
cargo as
connected.
the next 7 busiest ports in Europe do all combined, spanning across Russia, Germany, Spain, Romania, France, and Poland.
Okay,
The port also
all over
contains
Europe.
5 major oil refineries owned by giants like Shell and Koch Industries that enable the Netherlands to be a major hub of the global oil industry as well. As of 2022, the Netherlands has become the 6th largest importer of crude oil in the world, that they bring
Really?
in from just about everywhere. But they transform so much of that crude oil at the refineries in Rotterdam into finished end products like gasoline that they've become one of the top 3 global exporters of refined petroleum products, placing themselves just narrowly behind the likes of India and the United States in the process.
I don't know, like maybe I'm being very like silly about this, but I'm surprised that they work like with oil, with refineries and oils, because like especially like in this day and age, because I think they're moving towards being like a greener country. So isn't this a little bit like counterproductive, as in like you're greener, you want to move towards being a more sustainable, like greener country and not use as many like crude products, and you're trying to use other power sources that do not use this, and that they include like the less pollution. So I'm surprised by the fact that they're like, no, they're like among the top 3. So it is like, should you guys be doing this? Like, shouldn't you guys be like moving towards being like a greener country? So I don't know. I'm surprised about that. Maybe like the logistics are different, and I'm just maybe overthinking it. But I'm surprised.
process. What's really astonishing about this is that the Netherlands manages to export more refined petroleum products than even traditionally thought of oil superpowers do, like Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
Simply because the Dutch possess Rotterdam and control the vital refineries there that can actually transform crude oil into usable end products.
Yeah, of course.
And because they control the start of the pipeline network that radiates out from Rotterdam towards Belgium, France, and the industrial Ruhr region in Germany. They can quickly carry petrochemical products to exactly where they're needed. And the reason why this extensive pipeline network exists in the first place is because it also just so happened that in addition to sitting atop of the Rhine-Meuse-Scheldt River Delta with all of its unique geographic advantages, the little Netherlands also sat directly atop of the largest natural gas field that would ever be discovered on the European continent as well, right here. The giant Groningen gas field. This is another part of the story of the Netherlands' ridiculous OP status that is critical to understand. The Groningen gas field was only discovered by the Dutch in 1959, but it radically transformed the Netherlands forever afterwards. The field is actually the 10th largest natural gas field ever discovered globally, and it was central to the transformation of the Netherlands into Europe's most substantial natural gas supplier. Pipelines were built out that radiated out from the field that connected the entire country and eventually a good deal of Europe to its gas supplies, while the revenues and taxes earned on the field's production were central to the development of not only the Dutch welfare state, but to everything else that the country did, from the land reclamation projects in the Zuiderzee Works and the protective engineering of the Delta Works. Over the whole period of Dutch natural gas production between 1959 and 2018, from Groningen and various other smaller fields dotted all across the country, a total of 417 billion euros equivalent of cash were earned, with at least 85% of that amount being captured by the Dutch state, which greatly funded the country's ability to actually develop itself with the Zuiderzee and Delta Works. The Groningen gas field was eventually agreed to be phased out of production in 2014, and as of 2023, it has largely ceased all production, with its huge contribution to the Dutch economy over the decades sealed. Now, because of its central location and myriad connections all throughout Europe, the port of Rotterdam is also a major so-called re-exporter of goods as well, making it a huge hub of goods sold into the Eurozone area from outside countries like the UK, the US, and China. As an example, 1/5 of all the fresh fruit and vegetables that get imported into Europe from somewhere else come through via the Netherlands alone. And the port of Rotterdam alone accounts for more than 8% of the entire Netherlands' GDP. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise to you then that the enormous advantages of controlling Rotterdam and most of the Rhine-Meuse River Delta have enabled the Dutch to be a major trading power for centuries now.
Yes, it doesn't
Across the 17th century, the Dutch enjoyed their golden age when they basically invented capitalism, established a near-complete monopoly on segments of the global spice trade, and carved out one of the most influential and globally spanning trade empires that the world has ever seen. They brought enormous wealth flowing back to Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and the rest of the country. With the creation of that trade empire came a territorial empire for the Netherlands as well, that once spanned all across the globe from Indonesia to India to South Africa and the Americas. And while this territorial overseas empire gradually crumbled and fell apart, especially in the 20th century during the era of decolonization, the global Dutch trading empire never actually really went away alongside it. Far to the contrary, the Dutch largely kept their global trade empire generally intact, buttressed by their continued control of Rotterdam and their endless drive to expand the port's connections to the rest of the continent and to protect the port from the fury of the sea. The Netherlands is therefore still the 5th largest exporter of goods and services by value in the world, with even more exports pumped out to the global market than even countries like India, the UK, or Italy are capable of, and with a volume of exports that are close to approaching Japan's, a maritime nation with more than 7 times the Dutch population. Interestingly, of all the top 10 countries in the world by exports, all of them are generally regarded to be modern great powers of the 21st century, except for the Netherlands and Singapore, which each just punch way above their weights in this category.
Yeah, but it's
It's not just the exports of refined petroleum products that the country excels at either. As I mentioned at the start of this video, the Netherlands have somehow recently emerged as the 2nd largest exporter of agricultural products in the world as well, managing to export more than 2/3 of the agricultural products by value as the United States does, with only 5% of the same population and 234 times less land. Despite being located only around 1,600 kilometers from the Arctic Circle, the Netherlands has managed to earn the title of the world's second largest exporter of tomatoes behind only Mexico. While the country is the absolute largest exporter of other major agricultural products like potatoes and onions. Ornamental plants like tulips have long been associated with the Netherlands, but they were only introduced to the country by the Ottomans in the 16th century. And since that time, the Dutch have come to absolutely dominate the tulips
that's
production.
a long time ago.
A whopping 90% of the global production of tulips takes place in the Netherlands these days.
That's
and
what they're famous
80%
for.
of the world's tulip exports all come from here alone, giving the Dutch a practical monopoly on the tulips production, even in the 21st century. The start of the Netherlands' incredible rise to dominance in global agricultural and food production is often said to have begun in the desperation of the Second World War, when, over the winter of 1944-45, the Netherlands became the most recent Western country to suffer from a debilitating famine, in which as many as 22,000 Dutch people lost their lives. In the aftermath of the war and the ravages of the famine, the Dutch realized that with very limited available land in their waterlogged and densely populated rainy country, they would have to become the masters of efficiency in the agricultural business in order to ensure a reliable food supply.
What is that?
Just as they had to become the masters of efficiency at protecting their country from the water.
What are they eating?
Huge investments were made by the Dutch government into farming subsidies and rural infrastructure development to stimulate the country's agricultural sector. And then, nearly 2 decades ago, the country gave itself a challenge to produce twice as much food using only half as many resources. And since that time, the country has dramatically expanded the scope and scale of its technological innovations in farming to far, far exceed that original goal. Today, the Netherlands has some 24,000 acres of crops growing within artificial greenhouses, an area more than twice as large as the island of Manhattan in New York. And these greenhouses are just absurdly efficient. The temperatures and climates within them can be precisely controlled by farmers. LED lights can give the plants precisely how much light they need. Destructive pests can be easily kept out of them, eliminating the need for chemical pesticides. The plants within can be watered with precisely the correct amounts of water so they don't get too little or too much. And in many of them, even the carbon dioxide that gets generated by burning natural gas to keep the power going in them is simply piped directly back into the greenhouses by massive ventilators, where it just gets converted into oxygen by the plants, achieving 99% efficiency in the process. The result is that within these hyper-efficient greenhouses, the Dutch can grow fruits and vegetables year-round around the clock with bigger yields than anywhere else in the world. A single acre of land put beneath a greenhouse in the Netherlands is capable of growing the same yield of produce that would normally take 10 acres of traditional dirt farming to accomplish with significantly fewer resources to boot.
How come no one,
the average amount of water that it takes a Dutch farmer to grow 1 pound of tomatoes is only a half gallon, while the average worldwide is about 28 gallons. 56 times more water than what Dutch farmers use. The epicenter of the Dutch greenhouse farming movement is in the Westland region of the country, directly to the west of the huge port of Rotterdam. Here, you will find an almost endless landscape of glass greenhouses.
And I guess it's closer to, obviously they need to export things, so obviously it's more efficient to actually have them closer to Rotterdam as well. I think everything's so extremely thought out. It's like, this is insane.
From above, where 80% of the region's agricultural land is all contained within one. This hyper-efficient farming region alone contributes roughly half of all the horticultural production in the entire country. And its location directly next door to the port of Rotterdam enables its products to immediately travel all around the world to markets everywhere.
Like everything is
the Netherlands is also home to an enormous amount of research and development in the agricultural industry as well. The country hosts the incredibly prestigious Wageningen University and Research Center in the middle of the country that is widely regarded to be the global leader in agricultural science and research. And it basically forms the nucleus of the entire country's agricultural sector. Various agricultural science companies in the Netherlands spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually on research and development, which results in hundreds of new varieties of vegetables and seeds that are coming out of the country on an annual basis. Seeds themselves are another huge business in the country, with the Netherlands now dominating more than a third of the global trade in vegetable seeds, because the Dutch are damn good at producing extremely valuable seeds since they spend so much money on seed research and development.
One Dutch agricultural
agricultural
seed.
company called Rijkswaan managed to develop a tomato seed that costs less than 50 cents, but which is capable of producing an astounding 150 pounds worth of tomatoes.
Oh my
So
God.
valuable are the high yield and weather and pest-resistant seeds that Dutch companies like Rijkswaan produce that they are literally more valuable than gold. Since 1 kilogram of gold currently, as of this video's production, costs around $78,000, while 1 kilogram of Dutch-engineered tomato seeds can easily go for over $100,000. And this is all
It will
how
pay-
today the little Netherlands
would
has
pay
managed to
itself
find itself in the
future.
position of growing 6% of all the food produced in Europe on only 1% of the continent's actual farmland, and how the Dutch have managed to become the second largest agricultural exporter in the world, behind only the United States. And agriculture is hardly the only modern industry that the Dutch have managed to capture and nearly monopolize parts of. An industry that's even more lucrative, both from a financial and geopolitical standpoint, has been the
Why?
country's unique cornering of a key component in the global semiconductor and microchip industry that could ultimately
microchips.
make the Netherlands the kingmaker in who between the United States and China ends
Yeah,
up
isn't it
winning the
China?
21st century. If you asked a random person where the capital of the global tech industry is located, many would probably respond with San Francisco and Silicon Valley, with its host of tech companies
Yeah.
present. Others might suggest Seattle, where Microsoft and Amazon are headquartered, while others may insist on Taiwan, where the bulk of global semiconductor manufacturing
As well,
takes
yeah.
place at. But very few would argue that another contender for the capital of global big tech is here in a small suburb of the Netherlands' 5th biggest city called Veldhoven, a fairly
Next to
small
Little.
town with only 45,000 residents that you've probably
Oh.
never even heard of until right now.
Yes,
but
true.
Veldhoven is extremely important despite its small size because it is the headquarters of a company that you may also have never heard of called ASML, an acronym for
No
Advanced Semiconductor Materials Lithography. As it stands currently, ASML is the third most valuable company by market cap anywhere in Europe, and it is
Oh,
by far
okay.
Europe's most valuable tech company, with a total market cap in early July of 2024 that exceeded $420 billion, equivalent to
Wow.
more than 1/3 of the entire Netherlands' GDP. The company's tremendous success is also only a fairly recent phenomenon, with their market cap having roughly quintupled over just the past 5 years since 2019. The reason why ASML has exploded onto the world scene these past few years is because they're literally the only company in the world that builds the tools that are required to produce the most advanced semiconductors and computer chips that go into pretty much everything from smartphones to
Oh.
guided missiles to artificial intelligence. A 21st
They make
century
the
Dutch
equipment.
trade monopoly that's probably even more influential and powerful than the Dutch monopoly over the spice trade during their golden age was in the 17th century.
Yeah.
You see, ASML was founded 40 years ago back in 1984 as an
It's so
unlikely to
recent.
succeed joint venture between the Dutch electronics giant Philips and another company called ASM International, which
Who's
built
laughing now?
semiconductor equipment. The new company, ASML, planned to produce machines that specialized in a process known as photolithography, which itself has history that goes back decades before ASML's founding.
Yeah.
Photolithography is a complicated process whereby a blueprint of small circuits are crafted by beams of light that are guided through a series of lenses and mirrors towards a photosensitive silicon
This is very
wafer.
complicated.
The light will essentially create the design of the computer chip layer by layer, which eventually forms circuits that goes on to create the computational foundations of our entire modern world. Now,
Yeah,
the precise
it's very
kind of light
complicated.
used by photolithography machines is incredibly crucial to understand. And early on, back in the 1960s, when this technology was first coming around, they primarily relied on using only visible light beams, which have a relatively large wavelength and are only capable of building out pretty large features on the silicon wafer, which is undesirable because the smaller you can get the transistors, the more of them you can pack onto the silicon wafer, and the more powerful the chip ultimately becomes.
Oh.
Smaller and smaller wavelengths of light were steadily used by photolithographers to build more and more powerful chips until ASML came around in the 1980s to throw their hat in the ring too. By 1986, ASML had produced their first prototype photolithography machine, but it was extremely rudimentary and was only capable of creating individual transistors on the scale of micrometers. And it was basically more of a glorified photocopier than a true marvel of engineering. The company
Okay,
struggled to
sounds
actually
impressive to
find
me either
customers
way.
against the industry leaders of the time, made up by the Japanese firms Canon and Nikon. And so, ASML was only kept alive for years by its parent company, Philips, and by subsidies that came from the Dutch government.
Yeah, Philips is
but by
huge.
1995, ASML was still able to grow just large enough to go public and list itself on the New York Stock Exchange, just as the company was beginning to plan out a new photolithography machine that would harness a new idea called extreme ultraviolet, or EUV lithography. You see, visible light has a wavelength that ranges between 380 and 750 nanometers, while ultraviolet light is much smaller with a wavelength that only ranges between 100 and 400 nanometers, which means that by the 1980s and 90s, when photolithography machines were harnessing ultraviolet light, they were capable of producing much smaller patterns on chips than the previous generations of visible light machines were capable of.
They were lucky.
And so, computing power was getting stronger. Extreme ultraviolet light, or EUV light, is a fraction the wavelength of even regular ultraviolet light, ranging only 13.5 nanometers. For decades, nobody had quite figured out how to actually use EUV light in photolithography machines to produce even smaller transistors and
They came along.
circuits. Because producing it and working with it is an absolute devil of a task that requires an absolute mastery of physics to actually pull off. Canon and Nikon, the industry leaders at the time, were pursuing EUV technology as well, but abandoned it by the early 2000s as the costs of R&D ramped up and doubts emerged as to whether or not it was even going to be possible. ASML, however, stuck to the course of pursuing EUV technology regardless of the skeptics and sunk massive amounts of capital and time into research and development of the tech.
They're like,
Over
"We can do it."
17 years, from 2000 up until 2017,
Took them so long.
ASML blew through $6.5 billion on EUV research and
expensive.
development, and had only managed to ship out a handful of products over that entire time. But then, finally, after all that time and all that
It paid
cash,
off.
in 2017, the long bet of ASML and the Netherlands on EUV technology would finally pay off when the company
I think it's kind of crazy. I'm thinking like, well, it took 18 years. I'm thinking, well, that's a really long time. But they're really doing something that no one has ever done before. So it is obviously like, well, of course it's not going to happen overnight, but it's kind of crazy that they're making like scientific breakthroughs, and it only took them like 18 years, which obviously it's like in the sort of like huge scale of time, like in the scientific scale, I think it's probably like quite short actually. However, if you think about it, like the humans working on this and the people investing money on this, it's like, oh my God, it's like so like it took us like so long. You can see why people were like, obviously they were investing because it was so expensive. I cannot even like imagine the conversations that we're having of like, we have to give up. Like this is bleeding money and like this is not working. And people were like, no, we have to power through. But obviously it paid off, but I'm wondering how many of this like little ventures do not turn out. So it is kind of like you have to know where to stop. I don't know. I think it's crazy. It's a crazy situation all around. And obviously like it paid off and good for them, but I'm thinking of like what happens if they don't. Like it's crazy.
actually managed to roll out an EUV photolithography machine that not only worked extremely well, but also actually made economic sense to purchasers of the machine. The 2017 EUV machines that ASML produced were not cheap, costing around $100 million each to buy. But
Yeah,
they
of
print chip
course.
designs so small and do them quickly enough that all of the gigantic semiconductor manufacturing companies immediately ordered some. From
Okay.
TSMC on Taiwan, to Intel in the United States, to Samsung in South Korea.
Yeah, like, everyone
ASML
uses
sold
this.
10 of these $100 million machines in 2017 alone.
10.
And dozens of additional orders were placed on backlog. After decades of effort, ASML in the Netherlands suddenly emerged in 2017 as the only company in the entire world that was producing EUV lithography machines.
It's crazy to think of
Essentially
like it's only 10, but it's like, yeah, when each of them costs like more than $100 million, again, it's like, it'll pay itself. It's okay, but it's a crazy thing to think of. Like, they only sold 10. I'm thinking, oh, they sold a lot of them, but it's like, no, of course, it's an expensive machine that even though obviously big companies use them, like they're not going to order like 25 of this, but it's kind of, again, it's kind of like, it's crazy. Like, it's blowing my mind.
establishing a complete monopoly on the product in the process.
Yeah.
And since then,
That's
ASML's
good, create a
EUV
monopoly.
photolithography machines have only gotten more and more intricate and advanced, and they're difficult to even fathom. Their machines are now capable of creating features on a silicon wafer that are down to 1/50,000th the width of a human hair. Each one of their machines contains
You're
more
telling
than
me and I'm not understanding
100,000
it.
parts, and they weigh about 180 tons, while they're about the
Wow.
size of a double-decker bus. Inside of them, the machines will drop 50,000 tiny droplets of molten tin that are each no thicker than a fifth of a human hair, traveling at more than 250 kilometers per hour through a chamber every single second. Which all
This
gets
is
zapped
so
by a pair of
complicated.
outrageously precise lasers that creates a plasma that releases the EUV light that is then guided by mirrors and lenses towards the blank silicon canvas that eventually becomes a chip. The mirrors
Okay,
required
sure.
to guide this EUV light within the machine are ground down to probably be among the flattest objects in the entire universe.
Oh
They are
my
so
God, the
impossibly
universe?
smooth that the largest imperfection on them is no more than the distance grass will grow in a single millisecond. If the mirrors were scaled up to the size of Germany, there would be no
Okay.
bumps or imperfections on them larger than a single millimeter. And since EUV light gets absorbed by just about everything, including by air, this entire process has to take place within the machine in a total vacuum. Each of their newest EUV machines now cost more than $300 million
Oh my
to
God.
purchase, about the
Oh
same
God.
price as a brand new Boeing 777. And they are almost certainly the most highly sophisticated tool that humanity has ever produced and sold commercially.
Wow.
Even transporting one of these machines from ASML's factories in Europe to customers around the world is an insanely difficult and expensive process.
Yeah,
The
I can
machines have to be
imagine.
assembled and tested in the Netherlands first to make sure they actually work. And if
Yeah.
they're successful, the machine will be completely disassembled and transported to its customer using 20 trucks and then 3 fully loaded Boeing 747 jumbo
Wow.
jets. ASML
3?
has more than
Those boats.
5,000 supplier partnerships that it uses to build these fantastic machines. And each one requires the labor of about 100,000 people to actually create. They are very,
Wow.
very difficult to actually replicate, and so far, nobody else has managed to create an economical
imagine, like,
EUV
it's
lithography
highly-
machine.
the
And
people that
even
work
if
on
somehow
those.
someone else did, they would have to convince
Yeah, like also like the people that are able to work on these machines and are able to actually operate them. I'm guessing they are obviously like highly educated people and very specific, like a very specific field of work. And I don't think you can find them everywhere. They're probably only in the Netherlands, and people probably as I can only imagine as like this grows and like as this sort of like business grows, maybe like more people will come along. But like how many people can work on these machines? Like 300 people in the world, and they're all in the Netherlands, so it's crazy.
the small number of ASML's customers to abandon ship and switch providers, which will be hard because ASML already has the established relationships. There's
Yeah.
basically only 5 total customers in the entire world who buy these machines,
Oh my
and
God,
ASML
only 5.
is continuing to innovate and advance their own machines even further. This is all how ASML has come to dominate a whopping 83% of the global lithography market right now in 2024, with their sole monopoly over the production of EUV lithography machines. And it has made the entire outside world extremely, extremely reliant on the Netherlands and on ASML
Yeah.
as a result.
That's
Such
true,
is
that's
the
not-
importance of ASML's lithography machines that the former president and CTO of ASML, Martin Vandenbrink, exclaimed earlier this year that our prime minister was sitting in front of Xi Jinping, not because he was from Holland. Who'd give a shit about Holland? He was there because we are making EUV. Naturally, because ASML's EUV lithography machines are required to create the most advanced computer chips that are necessary for building the most advanced military equipment, the
It's
two global
military.
superpowers, the United States and China, are increasingly growing more and more dependent on the Dutch and their monopoly on EUV machines as a result. Whoever between them can maintain access to ASML's machines will inevitably wield the most technologically advanced military in the 21st century.
I was thinking
So,
computers,
to prevent
but no, it's
China from
military.
ever gaining access to the machines for their own chip industry and military, the United States has consistently applied pressure on the Dutch government to restrict ASML from selling their most advanced EUV machines to China.
So, like, yeah,
and in
of course.
2023, the Biden administration even pressured the Netherlands even further to restrict some of ASML's older, less advanced lithography machines to China as well. Despite China having been ASML's biggest market in
For the
2023,
client, yeah.
accounting for about a third of its total revenue for the whole year. There are fears that if ASML is eventually blocked out from China entirely, the Chinese will then have no other choice but to begin investing heavily into their own photolithography sector and to eventually build out their own EUV machines, which could finally provide ASML with some competition. But
Yeah.
until then, and as it stands right now, no other company in the
doing it.
world is anywhere close
How come
to
they're not
challenging
doing it?
ASML's dominance in this sector. And the company controls an absolute monopoly on the machines that make our entire modern world possible as a result. The latest monopoly in the long history of monopolies that have been enjoyed by the Dutch trade empire. Whether it's the control of these marvelous machines that make all of our technology possible, their vast greenhouses that nearly compete with the United States on food production, their control of the largest natural gas field in Europe, their control of the largest port in the world outside of East Asia, their vast network of internal waterways and infrastructure, or their conquest of new lands from the sea, the Dutch have proven themselves time and time again as the most overpowered country in Europe, punching far, far above what their own small population and small land
I'm not
size
sure
would
about that.
otherwise suggest. And I very deeply admire them for everything they have managed to accomplish. They have completely transformed their small, swampy, flood-prone river delta into a major
Sounds so
world
dismissive.
power that has continually withstood the test of time well into the 21st century today, that has defined human history, and that will continue doing so for the foreseeable future. To me, though, I think the most impressive fact about the Dutch is just how much food they're capable of producing in their small country. They're
That surprises
global
me as
leaders
well.
in cheese, tomatoes, and potatoes, and they somehow manage to export more meat than any other country in Europe does.
Also meat?
And if all of that stuff about the Netherlands' food production suddenly made you very hungry, you're not alone. And as always, thank you so much for watching.
Okay, this video was super interesting. I feel like I learned a lot of things. I think the most shocking thing, I think the video sort of like, you sort of use a little dismissive of like, oh, this swampy little land with like 8 million people and that it's constantly being flooded. Like, incredible that they managed to do this and they sort of like overpowered. But I don't know, is that though? Because thinking about like all the incredible things they have done, I think maybe I'm thinking maybe it's just me. Like, I'm thinking about this, like, I'm going at it the wrong way because I'm thinking, like, oh, overpowered, as in, like, it, I mean, because he actually said it. It's like you're punching above your weight, and it's like, I don't know if I agree with that because, again, you can see, obviously, they're not thought of like the Netherlands. I don't think it's usually thought of like as a global superpower because when you think of like a global superpower, you're thinking of like bigger countries. You're thinking of like the United States, China, France. Like you're thinking like Germany, Russia. You're thinking about like this huge like the land masses, but not always, right? Because I think like India, for instance, or even Brazil, they are like pretty big countries. But I don't think they're usually thought of like global superpowers, or like in some specific industries, maybe. But just in general, I don't think people like go like their mind goes there. And also like I'm thinking like even the UK, which I think is probably also like thought of like a global superpower, but the UK is not that big either. So I don't think like not necessarily like bigger land masses equal something of like, oh wow, you're very powerful. I think maybe like once a few like 100 years ago, well, that was the case, right? Because obviously they were like invading countries, invading like other cultures. So of course, like it made sense that you're constantly going to war. Like you like the one that has more territory is the one that's winning. But again, I think that's sort of like 100 years ago, 300 years ago. Like I think these days it's less important. Although, again, maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but it's like, it doesn't, like, what I'm going with this is that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be like, oh, a huge superpower because you have like a lot of territory. Like, as we can see, no, you not necessarily. Like, you can be a global superpower without having this like huge landmass. Although I get that the Netherlands is sort of like, it's sort of like the exception to the rule. Like you don't get to see that a lot of like smaller countries are able to do this. But I think it's less about like the territory and more about the people themselves. I think it speaks a lot of like how the Dutch have been able to like do like the most with what they have, and it's because they worked on this. Like, you know, it was a bit of luck. Obviously, like they mentioned, like they have Rotterdam, they have like this huge sort of like, and the country itself, it's located like in the center of Europe. And they do have like, again, it was like a gas thing situation as well. It's like, well, yes, it's a strike of luck, but not always that guarantees, oh, you're gonna be like, your country's gonna be pretty successful. Because as we've seen, like, not always, like the fact that you, by a strike of luck, you find yourself with a lot of resources, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually going to be able to actually exploit them and actually manage them in a good way. And again, we've seen that, in like throughout history, that's not always the case. But it's like, yes, it's good that the Netherlands was able to do that, because again, they managed to find like, hey, we were lucky in this situation. And maybe you can see like, obviously the flooding, like we're surrounded by water, that could be seen as a hindrance. Like that's not very good. Like that's actually, it's playing against us. But obviously I think, and it speaks again why the Netherlands is such a like, it's the exception and not the rule, is that they were like, well, instead of like working sort of like maybe against it, we can see like, what can we do? And that's, I think, what they said about like the Dutch, I think, built the Netherlands, something like that, because it's like, yes, what we have to make the most of what we have. So what can we do to actually take advantage of this? And they were like, hey, what can we do? We're going to engineer ourselves out of this problem. And I think obviously that's like where the outlier sort of like situation comes around. And I don't think it has anything to do with like, oh, they're like a smaller country, they don't really have a lot of people. It's like, again, it's more, I think, about like the mindset of like the Dutch. And obviously it's, you have to go around, I don't know, 300, 500, 600 years ago, where like they started like this whole situation of like, we have to work with what we have and actually prepare ourselves. But again, it's more like culturally, and I think it speaks a lot about like how Dutch culture, and it speaks more about how Dutch people are than anything else, because they managed to like what they managed to accomplish, obviously, like with the whole like the water system, the waterworks, like it's incredible. I don't think any other nation would have been able to do that. Not just because, again, it's not about the money itself, although I would love to have, like, because they were like, especially like during, I think it was World War II, or I think it was like one of those famines, they were like, we're going to invest in agriculture, because they realized, people are like starving. And it's like, yes, of course. And I think a lot of countries, if they put themselves in that situation, obviously they're going to be, well, that's the ideal. Yes, we have to invest in this. But how were they able to do that if they didn't really have any money? I think that's not always feasible. And that's the problem with I think a lot of countries do have that problem of like, they don't really have the money. Or, the people in the government are, it's a lot of corruption, so they're not able to do so. So I think it speaks more about like the Dutch mentality and the culture of Dutch people, that they have been able to like actually accomplish this kind of things. Because I think other countries may be like, yes, we're going to do this. It sounds great. Like the plan, incredible. Let's do it. But when it comes to actually do these things, like they're not able to, because again, it's corruption. People, there's like bad people in power, like the government, I don't know, like just decides that it's not a good idea, or that no, it's going to be way too expensive. But in this situation specifically, I would have loved to have known like how exactly they managed to have the money to actually like invest in this whole like the waterworks situation, for instance, because obviously I think that was like the beginning of the whole thing. But again, it obviously is like incredible management as well, and obviously incredible engineers, because that was like the start. And I think once you had kind of like solved the problem of like the flooding and the water, and you have, you have like this big land masses, and then we can invest in agriculture because now we have the land. And that's how you sort of like, you climb up the ladder up until like the final sort of like a final boss situation, which is like the one we're seeing these days with like the laser situation. Because it's like, yes, that's like, well, once you conquered everything of like this, like the greenhouses, like the I think that's incredible to me. The fact that even because they don't, again, it's like, I think that's probably the most impressive, is that they don't really have a lot of like, and again, with the landmass, and I said, it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be like a global superpower. But when it comes to like exporting like agriculture, tomatoes, whatever, produce, you need the actual land to actually grow these things. And even cows, if it's meat, if it's milk, whatever, you actually need like, you need the territory, you need the space. So it's crazy that they're like, yes, they're like the biggest exporter of tomatoes, or the second biggest. And in Europe also, I think they're like the biggest. And it's like, how? Because again, that's probably the most surprising thing to me, because it's like, where exactly are they getting their landmass, especially compared to places and countries that are bigger, like Germany or the United States? Just, you obviously have more territory. Of course, it makes sense that the places with that you have more territory, you have more land, they're going to be able to grow more things. So I think it's an incredible feat that they have managed to do this. And it's like, well, they engineered like the seeds in order to like, yes, because we're going to grow more tomatoes, and we're going to grow more tomatoes in a more efficient way, and it's gonna take us like, it's gonna be cheaper. It's gonna take a shorter amount of time, and it's gonna produce a lot more tomatoes. So it is like, oh my god, it's crazy that everything can be engineered, and it's like, it's making me, well, I'm not gonna be an engineer, but I think it's incredible. And if I were following that career path, I think I would definitely go to the Netherlands, because I think they're like the greatest engineers in the world, not just in the sense of like the infrastructure that, as we can see, like they're like other countries are calling up on them and see like, hey, we have obviously, again, like the global climate situation is going to worsen. It's only going to worsen. More places are going to be flooded. How were you able to actually solve the situation? And of course, they're speaking to like Dutch engineers, because they were the ones that they're the experts. And it's like, yes, how come other countries are not following along? Obviously, I think that's where like the money part comes from, and obviously each country has its own government, and not everyone has the money, and not everyone has like good people in the government and the higher up areas. So that's sadly, well, not everything can be replicated because of that. And again, it's the Dutch people, and it's like, it's incredible. The whole, like, the most surprising thing as well to me is the whole like the ASML company. I think it was ASML company. I mean, like, again, I already spoke about this. It's crazy that it took them 18 years, and, I can't even imagine how stressful those years were for the people working on this, for the people invested in this, for, like, the owner of the company. It's gotta have been, like, a huge, like, uphill battle, and I can only imagine there were, like, a lot of years and a lot of times where people wanted to, like, desist and be like, no, you know what, I'm giving up. But they didn't, and obviously, incredible, it paid off for them, but it's kind of crazy that other countries are not getting on this, because if I'm a global superpower as well, I'm like, well, I want to replicate, what the Netherlands did, because like they said, they have the monopoly, and I'm thinking those machines are incredibly expensive. They have the monopoly. We are obviously, because again, everything uses this. So it's like, okay, I want to have this kind of like machine in my own country, so I can also like maybe not dominate the market, but at least like give them some competition. It's not good to depend on just one single thing. I think like if history has taught us something, is that it's never a good thing to just have like one. You should always have like a plan B, and you shouldn't just depend on one country or on one thing in particular. So if I'm another country like Russia or China or the US, I'm gonna be thinking, we have to build one of these machines. And, it speaks highly of the fact that they haven't been able to like replicate them. I don't really know, because I can only imagine that of course they want to replicate them. Like, they're actively working on this, because obviously it's going to be cheaper. Like, they're not going to be paying someone else for these expensive machines. Like, no, we have to make it all in-house, and it's going to be cheaper, and we're not going to depend on someone else. So it's like the perfect situation. So I think, again, I can only imagine that they're working on this. But the fact of the matter is that simply they haven't been able to replicate them, and it's like, that's why we still have to depend on them. But again, like, probably like China, it's probably like working on these machines, and the US as well. Like, I kind of like refuse to believe like no one's working on these machines. They obviously want to replicate them. But yes, of course, the Netherlands is like, well, we're not going to give you the technology. Obviously, we're not going to give you the know-how. Like, you have to figure it out that yourself. And of course, they are highly trained people, and again, it doesn't come cheap. I'm wondering how much they earn actually, like the technicians and the people that work on this company and then this specific machine. I'm wondering about their salaries. I'm very curious, because again, I'm thinking it's like highly like skilled job that not a lot of people in the world can do. And they had to have like great salaries. Would love to know how much they earn like yearly, just because I'm curious. But I don't know. I think in the future we're gonna probably like they're gonna figure it out. Like, probably China and probably the US are gonna figure this out. And I get from the USA and China have their own like thing of like, no, you can't. You have to like forbid China to do this. But of course the Netherlands Netherlands. Like, I'm not gonna get into like politics because I think at the end of the day, I'm just, obviously everything's politics, of course, but I think I can't actually like I can outlaw or forbid like these people to actually, they want to buy these machines while, I'm gonna sell them to them. It's not like, no, you're China, I'm not gonna sell them to you. I think maybe they can't, like, unless there's like sanctions involved or something, it's like, no, you can't really do that. And I understand why they're probably like, no, yeah, we have to sell them, and that's it, because it's like we're remaining neutral, and of course also like they're earning a lot of money, so it's gotta be a little bit hard to say no to like that amount of money, because again, it's a huge amount of money, and you're like the only one doing this, so it is kind of like, you put it in a balance. It's like I would sell it to the highest bidder. I would be like, I'm selling it to everyone that has the money. Basically, if I were the Netherlands, that's what I would do, and I would take advantage of the fact that while I'm still sort of like in the monopoly of it all, and I'm still the only one that is able to do this, I'm gonna exploit this. I'm gonna earn as much money as I can, because I know that the other countries are gonna follow along probably in the next like 5 or 10 years. So as much as I can, I'm gonna exploit this. So I don't know, that was like, maybe that's me personally, and obviously there's like a lot of other, if I were in that position of power, probably like, no, my decision would be different, or maybe, there's like other factors involved. But me, just, as a plain Jane, I think it would be like, no, I would definitely sell it to everyone, because I'm like, I have to take advantage of this while I still can. But this was a very interesting video. It was, again, very, very helpful and very informative. But that was it for today, and I'll see you soon. Bye!